40 years ago this month, the trajectory of the labor movement and American society changed forever. As the United States was entering another economic recession, Ronald Reagan, who had just been sworn into office in January, used the power of his office to break a strike by the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, firing 11,345 striking workers and permanently banning them from ever working for the federal government again. It's a story that lives in infamy, a truly dark day on the historical path that led us to where we are today. Or, depending on who you ask, it was the triumphant moment when the government helped the unchecked will of the market break through the barricades of one of the last bastions of civil society, where working people still had the power to assert that their world, our world, should be organized around more than business's competitive quest for profit. The labor movement, imperfect as it was still the primary mechanism through which workers could collectively tell the rest of society, in their own words, what they wanted, what they needed, and what social progress should look like. Let's not forget that it was working people who said, we want civil rights and home ownership. We want to retire with dignity and have weekends off. And working people forced society to make those adjustments for a time. But now those gains have been taken back by the business class vultures who peck our lives and wallets clean. And the labor movement, imperfect as it was still the primary muscle that working people had and used to make sure that their wants and their needs weren't simply ignored like they so often have been for the past 40 years. For 40 years, as we have lost most of that muscle, as we have lost our seat at the societal bargaining table, the only mechanism that has been left for us to express our collective wants and needs is really the mechanism of electoral politics. So this has meant, first and foremost, that the vast working class of this country, which may have had in the labor movement the opportunity to determine and fight for its own wants and needs as a class, has been permanently splintered into three main groups, divided not by class interests, but by political affiliation. And that's Democrats, Republicans, and the great mass of non-voters. What's worse, the process of limiting working people's societal bargaining power to the ballot box has more or less confined our political imaginations and political engagement to the model of individuals asking management for help. As an ill-defined mass of individuals, the political managerial class is by no means beholden to our will, nor are they required or forced to address our wants and needs, and that is by design. I think the same rule applies to the other mechanism that, in the 40-year wake of Reagan breaking the PATCO strike, has been provided by the powers that be to register and respond in some way to our wants and needs. That other mechanism is the mechanism of consumerism, the quote-unquote power of the purse. 40 years after PATCO, the challenge for most of us is not only living in a world where our mechanisms for having a say in how society works have been reduced to this, but living in a world where the majority of us have forgotten that it was ever otherwise. And here comes the amnesia part. So by now, I think that many of us know the story. But I'm going to give a Spark Notes version here, and there are a lot of important details that I'm paving over, so please don't yell at me in the comments. Instead, share resources for folks who are watching. But if you want to know more about this, I would highly encourage you all to read up on it. And of course, you got to start with Joseph McCartin, who wrote what is pretty much kind of the definitive book on the subject. And that book is called Collision Course: Ronald Reagan, the Air Traffic Controllers, and the Strike That Changed America. So in absence of McCartin's book, here's what I'll say. PATCO was originally formed in 1968, and the Union Drive was partially the result of a high-profile mid-air plane crash that happened in New York in 1960, which made air traffic controllers realize they needed more robust and formalized supervision over the work that they did. Since air traffic controllers were employees of the federal government, though, and this would be the crux of Reagan's drastic actions against PATCO, they were prohibited by law from striking. let alone negotiating over hours and wages. But the union had found creative ways to act collectively and effectively force the government to negotiate with them, including, they did things like coordinated sickouts and slowdowns. And I mean, those actions did not always go the way that the union wanted. But for a number of reasons that I won't, go into here, the net result in the decade leading up to the 1981 strike was that the union and its members were feeling emboldened in their bargaining position. And they were not fans of their dealings with the Federal Aviation Administration under Democratic President Jimmy Carter. And so there are two crucial details to pull out here before I get to the actual strike. First, it should be understood that PATCO and its membership operated primarily as a trade association or something like a guild, relying more than anything on the irreplaceability of its skilled workers. Many air traffic controllers had gotten their training in the military. Many had been involved in the Vietnam War, and thus some had kind of a cultural conservatism with them, but that's a topic for another time. So one of the most constant refrains from workers during the strike in 1981 was that there was no way in hell the government could effectively and safely replace all the skilled workers who went on strike and were subsequently fired. And this was partially true, but, really a combination of really bad luck, right? I mean, a combination of managers and scabs who filled in for striking workers, along with the recession that I mentioned earlier, which reduced demand and the number of flights in the air, meant that the system was able to hold during the PATCO strike. This attitude by PATCO also meant that the union did not have a really robust support from the rest of the labor movement when it defied the government. They did get nominal support from like the machinists, and there was talk of machinists refusing to cross the picket line, but that ultimately didn't materialize into any concerted action. And the pilots union, for example, was openly antagonistic towards the strike because pilots were feeling resentful that the resulting reduction of flights would lead to layoffs among their ranks. So the second kind of detail to pull out here, it's a well-known detail, but one that can't be repeated often enough. PATCO was one of the few unions to endorse Reagan's presidential run in 1980. Having grown exhausted with the Carter administration, like I said, and hoping that Reagan's own past as a union president of the Screen Actors Guild, let's not forget, Reagan was president of SAG twice, that coupled with the PATCO endorsement, they hoped that that would make Reagan more of an ally in the upcoming negotiations. And so PATCO bucked the rest of the labor movement and temporarily put themselves on the right-hand side of the man who would eventually crush them into unbeing. So in February of 1981, PATCO began negotiating a new contract with the Federal Aviation Administration. At the time, the lion's share of media attention, and you can go on YouTube and look at a lot of the media coverage, but a lot of that media attention was focused on PATCO's ambitious demands for dramatic increases in pay and benefits, including a $10,000 across-the-board pay increase for their members, together with a 10% raise in the contract's second year. But actually, the biggest sticking point for the union was one regarding working conditions. Averaging more hours on the job and more overtime than their European counterparts, PATCO was demanding a 32-hour work week, 4 days a week, 8 hours a day, along with upgrades in equipment. And in June of 1981, the FAA offered the union a contract that included an 11.4% wage increase over 3 years, but the contract did not offer provisions for reduced hours, and PATCO's membership ultimately rejected it. And on August 3rd, 1981, 13,000 workers walked off the job, which is a really staggering number. On that same morning, Reagan gave his infamous ultimatum to the strikers in the Rose Garden. And so we actually pulled that clip from that for us to watch here.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. This was the culmination of 7 months of negotiations between the Federal Aviation Administration and the union. At one point in these negotiations, agreement was reached and signed by both sides, granting a $40 million increase in salaries and benefits. This is twice what other government employees can expect. It was granted in recognition of the difficulties inherent in the work these people perform. Now, however, the union demands are 17 times what had been agreed to, $681 million. This would impose a tax burden on their fellow citizens which is unacceptable. I would like to thank the supervisors and controllers who are on the job today helping to get the nation's air system operating safely. In the New York area, for example, 4 supervisors were scheduled to report for work and 17 additionally volunteered. At National Airport, a traffic controller told a news person he had resigned from the union and reported to work because, quote, "How can I ask my kids to obey the law if I don't?" End quote. This is a great tribute to America. Let me make one thing plain. I respect the right of workers in the private sector to strike. Indeed, as president of my own union, I led the first strike ever called by that union. I guess I'm maybe the first one to ever hold this office who is a lifetime member of an AFL-CIO union. But we cannot compare labor management relations in the private sector with government. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being. It was in recognition of this that the Congress passed a law forbidding strikes by government employees against the public safety. Let me read the solemn oath taken by each of these employees, the sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
All right. So I figure we can really dissect that when we're all kind of chatting again. And I apologize to everyone whose blood is now boiling, but I thought it was important that we watch that statement in full because there are a lot of important little details in there to unpack. But let me get through the rest of this kind of script here so that we can kind of have a discussion about this. So on August 5th, Reagan made good on his threat and fired the 11,345 striking air traffic controllers who did not return to work. But it got even worse. In a truly vindictive act, Reagan also banned these workers for life from working for the federal government. Clinton would later rescind that, but only, a small percentage of those workers ever went back to working for the federal government. But also, PATCO was decertified as a union in October later that year. It was crushed. Now, as some commentators have pointed out, there are a number of ironies here. First, even though PATCO members were painted as greedy and ungrateful for demanding what was seen as an untenable amount of money from the federal government to cover those increases in wages and benefits, the amalgamated costs of firing over 11,000 workers and hiring and training new controllers in the years afterwards certainly exceeded that original price tag. And secondly, the union that would later fill the void left by PATCO, specifically the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, or NATCA, would eventually secure a lot of the gains that PATCO strikers were demanding in the first place. But the lasting damage was done. And the ripple effects of this momentous event went far beyond this one strike and this one group of workers. But in the spirit of everything we were talking about at the beginning of the show, in the spirit of my show, Working People, I think it's important to remember first and foremost the tremendous pain that Reagan breaking the PATCO strike inflicted on air traffic controllers and their families. And we have a clip of that.
For striking air traffic controller Gary Lohr and his wife Chris, this past week has not been an easy one.
I stopped reading the newspapers because they bring you down and put you in such a bad mood and depressed. You really feel like they are breaking you, but they're not. We're strong.
I guess the thing that bothers me most is that people think that we're out for a lot of money, which just simply isn't the case. 8 out of every 10 air traffic controllers in this country have said we're not going to go back to work. And there has to be a reason for that, because we're reasonable people just like everybody else. And I would hope that the president would realize that, but I don't think he has.
So the human cost of Reagan breaking the PATCO strike was enormous, right? Workers like this one, families like these were heartbroken, beaten, battered. There were suicides after this. A lot of people never really regained their economic foothold, right? That the kind of immediate casualties of this and the human pain that filled, that space was immense. But also Reagan's breaking of the PATCO strike was a signal to employees everywhere that it was officially open season on the labor movement. So here's a particularly infamous quote from Donald J. Devine, Reagan's director of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, that some of you have probably heard before. But Devine says, quote, "When the president said no, American business leaders were given a lesson in managerial leadership that they could not and did not ignore. Many private sector executives have told me that they were able to cut the fat from their organizations and adopt more competitive work practices because of what the government did in those days. I would not be surprised if these unseen effects of this private sector shakeout under the inspiration of the president were as profound in influencing the recovery that occurred as the formal economic and fiscal programs," end quote. And he wasn't wrong. Reagan stated that he supported the right of private sector unions to strike, and that the real issue with the PATCO strike was that it was an illegal act by federal employees who did not have that right. But the private sector, already sharpening its knives, heard what it needed to hear. In the years that followed, replacing striking workers became a commonplace practice in the private sector. Union membership declined to an all-time low. The share of profits between executives and employees went in completely opposite directions from this moment in history on, even as workers in the United States became more productive than ever and the cost of living rose. The breaking of the PATCO strike was an event that played an outsized role in shaping the world that we have grown up in, a world in which a once strong labor movement had its back broken, leaving working people to be systematically stripped year after year of their individual will to exercise their rights in the workplace and their collective ability to protect themselves from being crushed into subservience by the profit-seeking prerogatives of the business class, let alone their ability to make their own needs a priority in the arrangement of society. I guess I would put it like this in closing, right? A barrier had once existed, right, between the kingdom of workers and the kingdoms of government and business. Each had fortifications in their favor that protected them against the others, and that gave them power to exert their needs onto the list of society's priorities. And again, let's not forget that it was the government, like the orc battering ram of capitalism, that smashed the wall protecting workers. What coincided with that loss of worker power was a loss of our ability to have a say in how society worked and who was choosing what the future would look like. Over the span of 3 generations, I'd say, we collectively and often willingly gave into this social contract where we get to just pay rent in the world that the elite and ruling class want to make. A world where profit, not life or freedom, is the thing that must be protected at all costs and that government is used to protect. And we don't have to, we don't get to have any real say in how things work. And that's why, even though it can feel like we all hate each other all the time, I think we still all acknowledge that politicians aren't ever actually going to listen to any of us. And most of us feel like we don't have the power to do shit at work. In return, right, this social contract says that we get to enjoy the consumer comforts that this system creates for us. But even that has become more twisted in our lifetimes, right? Now, even those comforts that we get out of this deal, and practically everything else that we do or enjoy in our lives, now all of that is getting something out of us, right? Practically everything we say and everywhere we go is being tracked, every purchase recorded, everything has a goddamn computer in it and is sucking and selling data off of us. So I guess what I'm saying is that when Reagan broke the strike, it did a lot more than just break the back of the labor movement and break the lives of the workers involved. And it did more than rip almost all power from working people to make history. It also convinced us that this was the way it should be and the only way it was going to be. The dream of moving towards a future of our making and the dream of making history in our own image was replaced by the reality of living in a dream world fashioned by corporations and elite institutions that are perpetually out of reach. In the most sinister of ways, I think the legacy of PATCO is that the political and economic managerial class has made us all consumers of our own history. End of speech.
Very well said. I think there can really be no overstating how important that strike was for, remaking the society we live in. And I think, when we think about neoliberalism, I think there's a lot of trends you could see starting in the 1970s, kind of more at the structural economic level, like, higher interest rates. But I think it really took a subjective political factor to really inaugurate neoliberalism. And I think, with Margaret Thatcher, her first move was, if I can take on the miners and teach them a lesson, that's going to set the stage. And I think this was the moment for Reagan. And it's kind of interesting thinking about, as federal workers, they saw an opportunity there because, in 1970, not that too long before, postal workers went on a wildcat strike, which was illegal. But Nixon didn't feel, he had the ability to just fire them like Reagan did. And maybe that's because the social movements were a lot stronger than, what was in the air at that time. Maybe it was a riskier move. But I think just looking at that 11-year span kind of shows the difference in the context where the ruling class felt they could make such a bold move in 1981, but not in 1970.
I just want to quickly add on to that. Going off Margaret Thatcher, we have come to think of both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan as kind of the avatars of neoliberalism. Thatcher in the UK and, of course, Reagan here in the US. And so I think that the breaking of the PATCO strike is such a defining moment because, as Paul alluded to and has pointed out before on this show, so much of when people think about neoliberalism, I think a lot of what comes to mind immediately is stuff like privatization, austerity, the retrenchment of the welfare state. And that's all true. And all of those things characterize neoliberalism. But what is also characteristic of neoliberalism is just complete and ruthless and relentless assault on labor. And I think that Reagan, having won the endorsement of PATCO and then just completely turning around and crushing the union, is perfectly symbolic of that moment. I guess I would also want to ask you guys if you think that there is anything, I don't want to say positive, but what can we learn from the PATCO strike or the breaking of the PATCO strike that helps us now thinking about labor moving forward? Because it's depressing, obviously. Right. But
let's see, Paul, I'm taking a breather, so I'm throwing you under the bus.
How can I make this positive? I think on the one hand, just like don't ever really underestimate the state's willingness and ability to break labor that way. I think for labor still in the 1980s, there's still, first of all, union density was still pretty high. I think there was still a sense of like, yes, labor is part of the society. It's not going anywhere. So I think people at that time just thought, there's no way he's actually going to do this. And he showed that clearly he is. And maybe, I guess, in our time, we don't have as hard a time believing that they will do things like that. But I think it also just shows, the state's role in creating neoliberalism. It's not just that it's like corporate actors doing this, like the state is actively playing a role. And it really is just a lesson of we should pay attention to what our enemies are threatened by. And it's like, clearly they saw that if we're going to get this done, unions are the biggest force standing in our way. And this is maybe a lazy analogy, but it's like, what did the Nazis do immediately? They knew labor and the Communist Party, that's what we got to get rid of next. And really, that should just show us why we should value the labor movement, because it really is that force that really is the force that we have to really resist the ruling class.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you hit the nail on the head, both of you, right? That like the term neoliberalism gets thrown around a lot, and it can often to the point where it becomes so opaque and chock full of meaning that it means very little to people when we say it. But I think that something like the PATCO strike and the kind of fallout of it gives a really clear-cut example of what neoliberalism is and what it means, right? Because one of my the points that I'm kind of constantly making, to the point that if anyone who watches The Real News or working people hears me talking now, they're going to roll their eyes because they know I've said this a bunch. But what I constantly stress to people is that one of the greatest tricks that Reagan and the capitalist class ever pulled was convincing us that government and market are separate from one another, right? Reagan famously said, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. But what he was doing here with PATCO, what he did with his entire economic plan, was not get rid of government. He transferred the role of government to the market, and he used the levers and mechanisms of the federal government to make that transition happen, right? Like I said, it was the government, whether that be Reagan with the labor movement, whether that be Clinton with free trade and gutting welfare, right? They used the tools of government to smash what were previously kind of structures in civil society that gave working people power to assert their wants and their needs. Instead, what this did, what the reason why they needed to, break the back of the labor movement, and Alan Greenspan, the famous ghoul Alan Greenspan, was it? I forget how long he was chair of the Federal Reserve. I mean, 2004, he gave this kind of infamous speech, right, where he credited Reagan and the breaking of the PATCO strike for creating the necessary, quote unquote, flexibility in the market that would allow capitalism to kind of attain the new heights that it had always reached for, right? And this is a perfect example of how you can pave over just a universe of inhumanity in kind of like technocratic language. What Greenspan meant by flexibility, building off what Paul was just saying, is to kind of make us working people powerless as actors in the world, right? So that, the market and business could determine the shape of everything else, whether that is like, profit-seeking companies building a manufacturing plant in one town, then realizing that their labor costs could be cheaper overseas, so they close down, right? The flexibility means that unions don't have a say in that process. So when all those workers are left without a job and those families are left without a form of subsistence, the flexibility that Greenspan is talking about is this kind of economic magic that will spring up new industries and new job creators in that area to absorb those fired workers, laid off workers, so that we reach kind of that equilibrium of full employment, right? What it means is keeping all of us so close to the edge of oblivion that we don't have the power to get in the way of the profit-seeking prerogatives of the powers that be. We don't have a way to halt that machine. We just go where it tells us to go. We go where the jobs are created. We accept what employers are willing to give. And this was what that breaking of the labor movement meant for the capitalist class, was making the vast amount of us, the great working class of this country and beyond, right? These kind of little pawns that could be moved around at will.
And I love that term the Reagan advisor said about, cutting the fat from operations, aka, living wages, healthcare, all that sort of things.
All that useless stuff.
Yeah, the fat. And I guess one more thing in terms of a lesson, I think, listening to Reagan's speech at the press conference, he framed it in terms of, this is a tax increase on the average American we just can't accept. And I think just another lesson of like how increasingly necessary it is for unions to frame their fights in a way that's connected to the broader public. And we're in this dilemma where the smaller unions get, the less easy it is for someone who's not in the union to relate to it or know about it. And this is where, this concept of what's called bargaining for the common good is developed, and some unions have employed it very skillfully, like famously the Chicago teachers strike in 2012, more recently Los Angeles teacher strike, where they made it clear that like what we're fighting for is stuff that anyone, even if you're not in a union, will benefit from, you know, because that is the classic divide and conquer, especially in the public sector. That's what they always do, and they will keep doing this. It's also possible in the private sector. You know, one of the last great national private sector strikes was in 1997, the UPS strike, and they framed their slogan was "Part-time America doesn't work," meaning, you know, we're against everyone becoming part-time in this new economy, and that kind of resonated with the public in a way. So I think it's just another lesson that it's very important for unions to do that.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that that's one of kind of the, if not the lesson, right, it's one of perhaps the hopeful signs, something that I've noticed myself in working people, something that I'm sure we've all noticed, right? The very, like, going back to what I was saying before, right, about my conservative upbringing, we're all children of the 90s, right? The idea that like an Amazon union drive would be an international news story, that it would have such overwhelming public support, was unthinkable for most of my lifetime, right? And I think that, you know, that's that you kind of contrast that with the media coverage and the public kind of opposition to the PATCO strike, right? There was a lot of that divide and conquer, like you were saying. There's a lot of people saying, well, they're being greedy, they're demanding too much, they're demanding more than what I even have, right? So even the very notion that the labor movement can lift the floor for working people was flipped around and seen as just certain buckets of workers greedily taking more than what the rest of us have. What I think has changed, right, especially after the recession, is that more and more of us have been pushed into this downward funnel, what Bernie Sanders famously called the race to the bottom, right? Where, you know, something like the teachers' strikes of the past decade could gain that sort of popular support, both because of the organizing efforts of the people involved to build those connections with the community, to fuse those bonds with teachers, students, and so on and so forth, but also because all of us are getting screwed, right? And so many of us are looking around, and when we see people fighting for, you know, to not work 12 hours a day, to have like some day with their family, right, to make more than poverty level wages, we can identify with that more. In the 90s, we didn't, right, because we had this moment, this economic moment, where it felt like we could attain that middle class life without the labor movement. And then 2007 quickly reminded us that this system was never going to allow such a thing.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.